You think you belong here? People like you don't sit in federal buildings unless they're in handcuffs. That was the kind of arrogance Officer Ryan Calloway carried into every encounter. The kind that had just led him to target a quiet black woman he assumed was powerless, never imagining she was the federal judge who would soon decide his fate. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you're watching from and make sure to subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. The morning sun rose slowly over the limestone facade of the federal courthouse, casting long, dignified shadows across its wide marble steps. It was the kind of building meant to inspire respect, its towering columns and polished glass doors reflecting a system that promised order, fairness, and control. People moved in steady rhythms, attorneys clutching leather briefcases, clerks hurrying with files pressed to their chests, and uniformed officers standing at their posts like silent gatekeepers of authority. Among them walked Claudia Bennett. She moved without urgency, her pace measured, her posture upright, each step deliberate, as if she were in no rush to prove anything to anyone. Dressed in a simple navy blouse and tailored slacks, with a modest handbag resting against her side, she looked like someone easy to overlook, someone who blended into the background of a busy government building. Her hair was neatly styled, her expression calm, her eyes observant, taking in every detail without drawing attention to herself. To anyone watching, she was just another woman passing through security, another face in a sea of routine. But there was something about her stillness that did not quite match the chaos around her. She did not fidget, did not glance nervously at the line ahead, did not shift her weight like those eager to get through and move on with their day. Instead, she stood grounded, composed, as though the building itself revolved around her presence rather than the other way around. Inside, the air was cool and controlled, the hum of quiet conversations echoing softly against marble walls. Security checkpoints beeped and cleared in steady intervals, officers directing people with practiced efficiency. Claudia stepped forward when it was her turn, placing her bag gently onto the conveyor belt, her movements precise, unhurried. She offered no unnecessary words, no nervous smiles, just a calm acknowledgement of the process. A young clerk nearby glanced at her briefly, then looked away, seeing nothing remarkable. And that was the point. Claudia Bennett had spent years mastering the art of presence without announcement, authority without display. She did not need to demand attention, because when the moment came, it would arrive on its own terms. Outside, a patrol cruiser rolled slowly along the curb, its engine idling low, a reminder that power did not always announce itself with sirens. Sometimes it watched, sometimes it waited, and sometimes it made the fatal mistake of assuming it knew exactly who it was dealing with. The cruiser door creaked open with a slow, deliberate weight, and Officer Ryan Calloway stepped out onto the curb like a man who believed the ground beneath him belonged to him alone. His boots hit the pavement with heavy certainty, each step measured, predatory, his gaze already locked on a Claudia Bennett as she cleared the security checkpoint and moved deeper into the courthouse lobby. He did not rush. Men like Calloway never did. Power, in his mind, was something you let others feel before you even spoke. "Hey," he called out, his voice cutting clean through the quiet hum of the lobby, sharp enough to make a few heads turn. Claudia paused, not out of fear, but calculation. She turned slowly, meeting his gaze without challenge, without submission, simply acknowledging his presence. That calm, that lack of reaction, tightened something behind his eyes. "You," he added, pointing a finger as if selecting her from a lineup only he could see, "step over here." A second officer lingered near the entrance, watching with mild curiosity, but Calloway needed no backup to assert himself. He closed the distance, his posture expanding, shoulders squared, chin slightly raised. "What's your business in this building?" he asked, though his tone made it clear he was not asking. He was accusing. Claudia's voice, when she answered, was steady. "I have work here. No elaboration. No apology." That was enough to irritate him. His lips curled slightly. "Work," he repeated, dragging the word out as if testing it for cracks. His eyes scanned her from head to toe, taking in the simple clothing, the unassuming bag, the absence of anything that, in his mind, signaled importance. That's so? Because you don't look like you belong anywhere near a federal courtroom. A few nearby clerks slowed their pace, pretending not to listen, but their attention lingered. Claudia did not move. "I'm exactly where I need to be," she replied. The words were calm, but they landed with a weight that did not sit well with him. Calloway let out a short, humorless laugh. "See, that right there," he said, leaning slightly closer, his voice dropping just enough to feel personal. "That attitude is what gets people in trouble." His hand hovered near his belt, not drawing anything, just reminding her of what he could do if he chose. "I'm going to need to see some identification." Claudia held his gaze for a brief moment, then reached in her bag with slow, deliberate movements, careful, controlled, never giving him a reason to escalate. She handed over a simple driver's license. Calloway took it, glanced at it, then barely looked at her again before tilting his head. "Claudia Bennett," he read aloud, his tone dripping with skepticism. "Funny, doesn't ring any bells." He stepped closer again, invading her space now, testing boundaries, watching for any sign of discomfort. "You nervous?" he asked, though the question was laced with accusation. Because people who got nothing to hide usually don't act this calm. Claudia's expression did not change. That unsettled him more than anger ever could. He handed the license back with a flick of his wrist, careless. "You know what, I don't like this," he said, louder now, drawing more attention. "Something about you feels off." He turned slightly, gesturing toward a secured hallway behind the checkpoint. "We're going to take a little walk. Backroom, just to clear a few things up." It was not a request. When Claudia did not immediately move, his jaw tightened. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be," he added, his voice sharpening. A hand lightly touched her arm, not violent yet, but firm enough to signal control. Around them, the courthouse continued its routine, people choosing silence over involvement. And just like that, a quiet morning shifted into something heavier, something charged, as Calloway led her away, convinced he was in control of the situation, completely unaware that every step he took was bringing him closer to a reckoning he could not stop. The secured hallway swallowed the noise of the courthouse the moment the heavy door shut behind them, replacing it with a colder, tighter silence that seemed to echo off. The gray walls. Officer Ryan Calloway's grip on Claudia Bennett's arm tightened just enough to remind her that, in his mind, control had already been established. "Keep moving," he muttered, guiding her forward with a firm push that was no longer pretending to be polite. Claudia did not resist. Her steps remained even, her posture unchanged, her gaze steady ahead, as if she were walking into a place she had already measured and accepted. That composure, that refusal to react, began to irritate him in a way he could not quite explain. Most people filled this space with nervous energy, with excuses, with fear. She filled it with silence. They reached a narrow room tucked behind the main security area, a place with no windows, only a metal table, 2 chairs, and a wall-mounted camera blinking quietly in the corner. Calloway opened the door with a sharp motion and gestured inside. And he ordered. Claudia stepped in without hesitation, turning slowly to face him as he followed, and shut the door with a solid click. The sound lingered. "Go ahead," he said, pointing to the chair. She remained standing for a brief second, then sat down with controlled grace, placing her hands loosely in her lap. Calloway stayed on his feet, looming, pacing once across the small space like a man preparing to deliver a verdict he had already decided. "You know, I've been doing this a long time," he began, his voice low, but edged with something sharper now, something personal. "And I can spot trouble before it even opens its mouth." Claudia said nothing. He stopped pacing, turned sharply, and leaned both hands onto the table, bringing his face closer to hers. "You walk in here like you own the place," he continued. "No horsetastion, no nerves. That's not normal." A pause. "So I'm going to ask you again. What exactly are you doing here?" Claudia met his stare, her voice calm, unwavering. "I already told you. I have work here." The simplicity of her answer only fueled him. His jaw tightened. "That's not an answer," he snapped. "That's a line." and I don't like being fed lines. He straightened, exhaling sharply through his nose, then reached for her bag, sliding it across the table toward himself without asking. Let's see what you're carrying, he said. Claudia's eyes flicked briefly to the bag, then back to him. You do not have permission to search my belongings, she said evenly. The words landed, not as defiance, but as fact. Calloway let out a short laugh, humorless and sharp. Permission, he repeated. You think this is about permission? He unzipped the bag anyway, rifling through its contents with exaggerated movements. Each item he pulled out placed on the table with a careless thud. Papers, a wallet, a pen. Nothing that matched the suspicion he had already committed to. That only made him more determined. You people always think you can walk in here. Act like you're above the rules, he said, his voice rising slightly. Not today. Claudia's hands remained still in her lap. You are making a mistake, she said quietly. For a split second, something flickered across his face, doubt or irritation. It was hard to tell. Then it hardened into something else entirely. No, he said, shaking his head slowly. The mistake will be letting you walk out of here without figuring out what you're hiding. He stepped around the table, moving closer, his presence pressing into her space again, heavier now, more aggressive. Stand up, he ordered. Claudia did not move immediately. The pause, brief as it was, felt like a challenge to him. His voice sharpened. I said stand up. Slowly, deliberately, she rose to her feet, her eyes never leaving his. The air in the room tightened, thick with unspoken tension, as Calloway squared his shoulders, convinced he was about to break her composure, completely unaware that her calm was not weakness, but control he had not yet begun to understand. The air in the room seemed to tighten around them as Claudia Bennett stood, her movements slow, controlled, deliberate, her eyes locked onto Officer Ryan Calloway with a calm that refused to crack. That calm, that quiet defiance, finally snapped something in him. You think you're in control here? He said, his voice rising, no longer masking the edge of anger. You think standing there like that changes anything? He stepped closer, invading her space completely now, his presence looming, aggressive, demanding submission. Claudia did not step back. You are crossing a line, she said, her tone even, measured, almost clinical. I suggest you reconsider your next actions. For a fraction of a second, the words hung in the air, heavy with implication. But Calloway did not hear warning. He heard challenge. And challenge, to a man like him, had to be crushed. He let out a sharp laugh, shaking his head. Reconsider, he repeated. Lady, you don't get to tell me anything. He turned abruptly toward the wall, grabbing a pair of disposable gloves from a small box and snapping them on with quick, irritated motions. You want to come in here acting like you're above everyone else, like you don't have to answer questions? He reached toward a metal cabinet, yanking it open. Let's see how confident you feel when we take that attitude away. Claudia watched him without flinching, her breathing steady, her posture unbroken. This is unlawful, she said. Everything you're doing is being recorded. Her eyes flicked briefly toward the camera in the corner. Calloway followed her gaze for half a second, then scoffed. Good, he said coldly. Then there's a record of me handling a suspicious individual who refused to cooperate. He pulled out a small electric clipper from the cabinet, the kind used for basic grooming in holding areas. The device hummed faintly as he tested it, the sound low, mechanical, final. Sit down, he ordered, pointing to the chair again. Claudia remained standing. That was enough. His hand shot forward, gripping her shoulder, forcing her down into the chair with controlled but undeniable force. I said sit, he snapped. She did not resist physically, but her gaze never broke from his. That gaze unsettled him more than any struggle would have. He moved behind her, one hand pressing lightly but firmly against the top of her head to hold it steady. Let's take away that little sense of pride, he muttered, almost to himself, though loud enough for her to hear. The clippers buzzed to life, louder now, the vibration filling the small room. Claudia's hands remained still in her lap. No flinch, no plea, no raised voice, just silence. The first pass of the clippers cut through her neatly styled hair, the sound sharp, deliberate, strands falling slowly onto the floor below. Calloway's movements grew more assertive with each stroke, as if he were proving something not to her, but to himself. "See," he said, his voice laced with cruel satisfaction. "Everybody breaks eventually." But Claudia did not break. Her eyes remained forward, focused, distant now, as though she had already stepped beyond the moment. Each pass of the clippers only deepened the stillness around her, a silence that no longer felt passive, but controlled, intentional, waiting. The faint hum of the camera continued in the corner, capturing every second, every motion, every decision being made. And yet Calloway did not stop. He could not, because the moment he did, he might have had to face what he had just done. And he was not ready for that. Not yet. The clippers finally powered down with a dull click, the low hum fading into a silence, so heavy it seemed to press against the walls. Officer Ryan Calloway stood there for a moment behind Claudia Bennett, his chest rising and falling, his grip loosening as if the act itself had drained something from him, though his expression still clung to that familiar mask of control. Strands of dark hair lay scattered across the floor, uneven, final, a visual marker of what he believed was dominance. "There," he said after a beat, stepping back, his voice rough but laced with forced satisfaction. "That's what happens when people forget their place." Claudia did not move immediately. She remained seated, her back straight, her hands still folded neatly in her lap, as if nothing about the moment had shaken her center. Slowly, she lifted one hand and brushed it lightly across her head, not with panic or shame, but with quiet acknowledgement, as though confirming a fact already understood. Then she lowered her hand again. No tremor, no ruse, no reaction that gave him what he wanted. That unsettled him more than anything else had so far. "You're real quiet now," Calloway added, circling around to face her, searching her expression for cracks, for anger, for anything he could use to justify what he had just done. Guess that attitude didn't last. Claudia lifted her gaze to meet his. There was no fear there, no pleading, only a calm that had shifted, deepened, hardened into something colder. "Are you finished?" she asked. The question, simple and controlled, landed with a weight that made his jaw tighten. "You don't ask the questions in here," he snapped back quickly, almost reflexively, as if trying to regain ground he felt slipping. He gestured sharply toward the door. "Stand up. You're done here." Claudia rose again, just as slowly as before, her movements precise, composed, her presence unchanged despite everything that had just occurred. She adjusted the sleeve of her blouse, a small, almost ceremonial motion, restoring order where he had tried to create chaos. Calloway watched her closely, his irritation growing with every second she refused to react the way he expected. "Let me make something clear," he said, stepping closer one last time, his voice low, edged with threat. "You walk out of here, you keep your head down, and you don't come back causing problems. Because next time," he let the sentence hang, a warning meant to linger. Claudia did not step back. She did not look away. "There will not be a next time," she said quietly. Not defiant, not emotional. Certain. The certainty in her voice made something flicker again in his chest, something he immediately buried under annoyance. He scoffed, shaking his head. "Yeah," he muttered, reaching for the door and pulling it open. "That's what they all say." The hallway beyond was just as it had been, quiet, controlled, indifferent to what had just taken place behind the closed door. Claudia stepped past him without hesitation, her pace steady, her posture unbroken. She did not look back, and that, more than anything, left Calloway standing there for a brief moment longer than he intended, watching her walk away, a faint, unfamiliar tension settling at the edges of his thoughts. Because for the first time since this began, it did not feel like the situation had ended. It felt like something had just started. Claudia Bennett's footsteps echoed softly against the polished courthouse floor as she moved down the secured hallway, her pace steady, unhurried, as though nothing of consequence had just occurred. Behind her, the door to the holding room remained slightly ajar, and after only a few seconds, Officer Ryan Calloway stepped out, his expression tightening as something unresolved clawed at the back of his mind. He watched her for a moment, the image of her calm, unshaken composure refusing to settle into the narrative he had constructed. That was when he made his decision. "Hey," he called out sharply, his voice cutting through the corridor again, louder this time, more forceful. Claudia stopped, but did not turn immediately. A beat passed, then she slowly pivoted to face him, her gaze level, waiting. Calloway closed the distance quickly, his movements no longer measured but driven by the need to reassert control. "We're not done," he said, pulling a small notepad from his pocket and flipping it open with quick, irritated motions. "You think you just walk away from that?" "Not happening." He clicked his pen, the sound sharp in the quiet space. "I'm writing you up for failure to comply, suspicious behavior, and obstruction. You're going to sign it, and then you're going to leave. That's how this ends." Claudia said nothing at first. She simply watched him, her expression unreadable, her posture still perfectly aligned, as though she were standing in a courtroom rather than a hallway. That silence stretched just long enough to irritate him again. "You hear me?" he pressed, glancing up from the notepad. "Or are you still trying to figure out how you got yourself into this mess?" Claudia took a slow breath, then spoke, her voice calm, low, and precise. "Officer Calloway," she said, using his name with quiet certainty, "this is your final opportunity to stop." The words landed differently this time. Not a warning spoken in fear, but a statement delivered with absolute control. Calloway blinked once, caught off guard by the way she said his name, by the tone that carried no uncertainty. Then he scoffed, shaking his head as a smirk crept back across his face. "My final opportunity?" he repeated, almost amused. "That's rich." He stepped closer, lowering the notepad slightly, his eyes narrowing. "You really think you're in a position to give me warnings?" Claudia held his gaze. "If you proceed," she continued, her voice steady, unshaken, "everything that happens next will be on record. Every action, every decision, every word you've spoken." Her eyes flicked, just briefly, toward the security cameras mounted along the hallway. Then back to him. "And you will answer for it." The silence that followed was sharp cutting. For a fraction of a second, something shifted behind Calloway's eyes. Not understanding, not yet, but awareness. A sense that he might be missing something important. And then, just as quickly, it vanished, replaced by the familiar armor of arrogance. He let out a short laugh, louder now, dismissive. "You know what I hear?" he said, tapping the pen against his notepad. "I hear someone trying real hard to sound important." He flipped the notepad around and shoved it slightly toward her. "Sign it," he ordered, "or I can make this a whole lot worse for you." Claudia did not move to take the pen. "You already have," she replied quietly. The certainty in her voice did not rise, did not sharpen, but it carried a finality that hung in the air like a closing door. Calloway's smirk widened, mistaking that finality for defeat. "Good," he said, snapping the notepad shut. "Then we understand each other." And with that, he turned away slightly, already convinced he had won, already blind to the fact that in that moment, he had just rejected the last chance he would ever have to walk away. Calloway had barely taken 2 steps away when a voice echoed down the hallway, sharp, controlled, and carrying an authority that did not need to raise itself to be felt. "Officer Calloway." He stopped, not because he wanted to, but because something in the tone forced him to. Slowly, he turned back. Claudia Bennett was no longer standing where he had left her. She had moved several steps forward into the main corridor, where the hallway opened toward the central courtroom wing. And now, people were watching. A court clerk froze mid-step. A security officer near the metal detectors straightened instinctively, and a suited man carrying files halted as recognition flickered across his face. Claudia stood there, her posture unchanged, her presence now impossible to ignore. "We are not finished," she said. The words were not loud, yet they carried across the space with unmistakable weight. Calloway frowned, confusion tightening his features. "What is this?" he muttered, taking a step toward her, but slower now, less certain. Then it happened. The clerk who had paused suddenly spoke, his voice urgent, almost breathless. "Your Honor, the courtroom is ready." The title hung in the air like a strike of thunder. Calloway blinked. Once. Twice. His eyes shifted from the clerk to Claudia, searching, recalculating, rejecting what he thought he had just heard. "What did you just say?" he asked, but the edge in his voice was gone, replaced by something thin strained. Claudia did not answer him immediately. Instead, she reached into her bag, the same bag he had searched, the same one he had dismissed. From it, she withdrew a slim leather case. With slow, deliberate precision, she opened it and turned it outward. The gold seal caught the light. Federal Judiciary. Judge Claudia Bennett. The hallway went completely still. The silence was no longer passive. It was absolute. Calloway's breath caught. His eyes locked onto the badge, then lifted to her face, then dropped again as if refusing to accept what was in front of him. "No," he said under his breath, the word barely forming. Claudia closed the case and lowered her hand. "You detained me without cause," she said, her voice calm, controlled, each word placed with exact precision. "You conducted an unlawful search. You used physical force. And you humiliated a federal judge inside her own courthouse." Each statement landed heavier than the last, stripping away whatever illusion of control he had been clinging to. Calloway took a step back without realizing it. His shoulders, once squared with arrogance, now seemed to collapse inward. I didn't know," he said, the words stumbling out, his voice unsteady. Claudia's gaze did not soften. "You were warned," she replied. Around them, more personnel had begun to gather, their expressions shifting from curiosity to dawning understanding. The second officer near the entrance stood rigid, eyes wide, already sensing the magnitude of what had just unfolded. Calloway looked around, as if searching for something, anything that might anchor him back to the version of reality he had just lost. But there was nothing, no support, no authority left to stand on. Only witnesses. Only consequences. Claudia took a single step forward, closing the distance just enough to ensure he heard her next words clearly. "You will follow me," she said. Not a request, not a threat, a directive, the kind that carried the full weight of the system he had believed he controlled. And for the first time since this began, Ryan Calloway did not argue. He did not posture. He did not speak. He simply stood there, frozen, as the truth settled over him in full, suffocating clarity. The situation had not slipped from his control. It had never been his to control in the first place. The walk to the courtroom felt longer than it actually was, each step echoing with a weight that pressed down on Ryan Calloway's chest, tightening his breath, slowing his stride. He followed half a step behind Judge Claudia Bennett, no longer guiding, no longer controlling, but being led, his eyes fixed forward yet seeing nothing clearly. The courthouse that had once felt like his territory now seemed unfamiliar, its walls colder, its silence sharper, every passing glance from clerks and officers cutting deeper than any words could. By the time they reached the double doors of the federal courtroom, a quiet crowd had already formed, whispers spreading faster than footsteps. Claudia did not pause. She pushed the doors open and entered with the same calm authority she had carried from the beginning, her presence commanding immediate stillness. "All rise," the bailiff called out, his voice firm, echoing through the chamber. Every person in the room stood. Every person except Calloway, who hesitated for a fraction of a second too long before awkwardly straightening, his movements delayed, uncertain. Claudia moved to the bench, ascending with quiet precision, her robe already draped across the chair behind her. Without ceremony, she placed it over her shoulders, the fabric settling into place like the final piece of a truth that could no longer be denied. When she sat, the room followed. Calloway remained standing where he had been directed, now positioned at the center, exposed, the weight of every eye in the courtroom pressing into him. "Officer Ryan Calloway," Claudia began, her voice even, controlled, carrying across the room without strain. There was no anger in it, no raised tone, only clarity. "You are present here today as a defendant in a federal misconduct case already under review." A pause. "What has just occurred within this building will now, be entered into that record. A screen flickered to life beside the bench. The courtroom watched as the security footage began to play. The hallway, the detention, the search, the room, the clippers. Every movement, every word, every decision laid bare in cold, undeniable detail. Calloway's face drained of color as he watched himself on that screen. The confidence he once wore now replaced by a hollow realization that there was nowhere left to hide. A murmur rippled through the courtroom before being silenced by a single look from the bench. "Your badge," Claudia said, her gaze fixed on him. He hesitated, just for a second. Then, slowly, his hand moved to his chest. The metal felt heavier than it ever had before. He unclipped it, his fingers unsteady, and held it for a brief moment as if it might still protect him. "Place it on the table," she instructed. He obeyed. The soft clink of metal against wood echoed louder than it should have. "You are hereby suspended from duty effective immediately," she continued, "pending full federal investigation into abuse of authority, unlawful detention, civil rights violations, and misconduct under color of law." Each charge struck with precision, leaving no room for interpretation. Calloway swallowed hard, his voice barely forming. "Your Honor," Claudia raised a hand, silencing him instantly. "You had multiple opportunities to stop," she said. "You chose not to." The words were not harsh. They did not need to be. The truth carried enough weight on its own. Around him, the system he had once relied on now stood as witness, not shield. And in that moment, stripped of authority, stripped of control, Ryan Calloway stood exactly as he had treated others. Powerless. The courtroom remained still long after the weight of Claudia Bennett's final words had settled into every corner of the room. Ryan Calloway stood motionless where he had been left, his badge now resting on the table in front of him, no longer a symbol of authority, but evidence of everything he had lost. The silence that surrounded him was no longer charged with tension, but with clarity, the kind that follows when truth has been fully revealed and nothing remains hidden. Claudia watched him for a moment longer, not with anger, not with satisfaction, but with a steady, measured calm that reflected the purpose of the system she served. Then, without another word directed at him, she turned her attention back to the courtroom. "We will proceed," she said simply. And just like that, the machinery of justice resumed its rhythm. Papers shifted, pens moved, voices returned in controlled tones, and the case continued, not as a spectacle, but as a process grounded in law and order. Calloway was escorted out quietly, not with force, but with finality, two federal officers guiding him with firm, professional hands. He did not resist. There was nothing left to resist with. The doors closed behind him, and with that, his presence was gone, leaving only the consequences of his actions behind. Inside, Claudia remained composed, her focus unwavering as she carried out her duties, her voice steady, her decisions precise. There was no mention of what had happened beyond what was necessary for the record. No dramatics, no indulgence, only justice, delivered exactly as it was meant to be. Hours later, when the session finally adjourned, the courtroom emptied slowly, the earlier tension replaced by a quiet respect that lingered in the air. Claudia removed her robe with the same deliberate care she had shown throughout the day, folding it neatly over her arm. As she stepped down from the bench, those who remained in the room instinctively straightened, their eyes following her with a recognition that had not been there before. Not because of what had been done to her, but because of how she had carried herself through it. A clerk approached, hesitant at first, then steady. "Your Honor," he said softly, offering a nod that carried more weight than words. Claudia acknowledged him with a slight incline of her head. Nothing more, nothing less. She did not linger. She did not seek acknowledgement. She simply moved forward. The hallway outside felt different now. The same polished floors, the same quiet walls, but the atmosphere had shifted, lighter, steadier, as if something unseen had been corrected. Officers who had once stood casually now carried themselves with more awareness, their eyes following her not with suspicion, but with respect. Claudia walked through it all with the same calm presence she had entered with that morning. No rus. No hositashchen. As she reached the courthouse exit, the late afternoon sun cast a warm glow across the steps, softening the sharp edges of the day. She paused for just a moment, not to reflect on what had happened, but to breathe in the quiet that followed it. Then she continued forward, descending the steps with measured grace, returning to the world beyond the courthouse walls. Behind her, the system she upheld remained intact, not because it was perfect, but because when tested, it had held. And as she disappeared into the fading light, there was no need for words, no need for acknowledgement. The balance had been restored. Justice, steady and unshaken, had done exactly what it was meant to do. What makes this story linger is not just the act itself, but the quiet confidence behind it. Officer Calloway did not act out of chaos or desperation. He acted out of certainty. A certainty built over time, reinforced by small moments where no one challenged him, where assumptions went unchecked, where authority slowly drifted away from responsibility. And that is what ultimately unraveled him. Claudia Bennett did not defeat him with force or anger or even retaliation. She allowed him to reveal exactly who he was step by step, in full view of a system he believed he controlled. There's something deeply revealing in that. True power does not need to announce itself, and it certainly does not need to prove itself through domination. It simply exists, steady and unshaken, waiting for the moment when truth speaks louder than ego. In the end, this was never about revenge. It was about alignment, about restoring a balance that had quietly been disturbed long before this single encounter. And perhaps the most sobering part is this: the fall did not come from a single mistake, but from a pattern that went unchallenged for far too long. I hope you enjoyed that story. Please share it with your friends and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. In the meantime, I have handpicked 2 stories for you that I think you will enjoy. Have a great day.